Hello. Thank you so much to Anne Marie and everyone at Menla for inviting me to speak at this amazing summit. I feel so honored and grateful to be talking to all of you. Let me just share my screen. So I've made some slides for you. Okay. So today I'm just going to be talking about creating a sacred context for depression by looking at the therapeutic role of psychedelics and other wisdom traditions. So, as a comparative literature major in college, I've always believed in the power of stories. And the story about depression has been very focused on neurotransmitters and other aspects of the brain in recent decades, which is very important. And I think it's also important to think about the context of depression because context matters. Context is sort of like the set and setting of psychedelic journeys, which, as you probably already know, in the psychedelic world, set means the inner context, like our mindset and emotions going into a psychedelic experience. And setting means the outer context, like the people we choose to journey with, if anyone, and our physical environment for the experience. So psychedelics teach us how much context matters because they are uniquely susceptible to set and setting. And it can mean, for example, the difference between having a really bad trip where you never want to touch drugs again, to having one of the most healing and meaningful experiences of your life, as maybe you've already heard about earlier on the summit. As the writer Joan Didion says, we tell ourselves stories to survive. And so I'm wondering, what stories can we tell ourselves about the suffering that we're collectively going through right now, including but not limited to depression, that can help us move through these trippy times with more ease and grace? And to that end, we're going to first look at depression, and then we're going to look at this concept called the descent that I will explain more about. That's sort of like a reframing of depression. Then we're going to look at psychedelics, how that relates to descent and depression. And we're going to finish off, if you stick with me to the end, we're going to look at tools for the road to help you in this journey ahead. So first, some quantitative context. As we probably already know, even before COVID, depression was a huge problem. It was a leading cause of disability worldwide, and rates were only steadily rising. And during COVID, I mean, we're still in the thick of things right now. So these are sort of just snapshots. But from one study that combined, it was a meta-analysis of 12 community-based studies. It estimated the prevalence to be about 25%. In another study, it said that depression is now 3 times higher compared to how it was before. And then in yet another study, they surveyed over 5,000 adults in 1 week in June. And I don't know if you remember June, but that was a really intense month. A lot of things happened. So maybe it was no wonder that 31% reported depression and anxiety at that time, and 11% reported contemplating suicide the week prior. So these numbers are probably no surprise to us. And when I see such high numbers, and sometimes have experienced depressed days myself in this pandemic, like pretty much everyone I know, thinking about depression as like another disease to fight, sort of like a parallel mental health pandemic, not only makes me tired, but it kind of almost seems a bit simplistic. Of course, there's that level as well, and which I also live every day as a psychiatrist. But I also wanted to find a greater perspective on the collective emotional suffering that could give this experience more meaning. And so I started piecing together this way of thinking about depression I'm going to call the descent. Um, I like the word descent because it kind of describes this general direction of going downward, which can be interpreted as a down mood, as well as the idea of going down into the earth, into the depths of the psyche, in an underworld journey that actually can be found in many different traditions. There are obviously many different ways to think about psychospiritual growth, but one map that made a lot of sense to me was described by Bill Plotkin in his book Soulcraft. So the words spirit and soul are loaded and obviously used differently in different contexts, but if we thought of spirit as a single great and eternal mystery that like permeates and animates everything in the universe yet transcends all, and soul as a vital, mysterious, and wild core of our individual selves, an essence unique to each person, then the journey to spirit can be thought of as one of ascent, kind of associated with the rising sun, with boundless emptiness of space, a journey into the upper world, sort of like the upper and lower world of shamanism. a union with light, conversing with angels or ascended masters, and the journey down below, the descent, as sort of associated with the setting sun, the descent to our earthy roots, into the wildness of the soil and the soul, a journey into the underworld. If you are familiar with Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey, which is basically essentially like the plot line to every single story ever told in human history, uh, this is sort of like that, except a darker, more twisted version. Um, so, so basically, in a holistic, integrated spirituality, there would be a balance of both processes. Like if you're always going to go up, you become overly identified with transcendence. You might run the risk of spiritually bypassing, of not being grounded. But if someone who's like overly identified with the descent journey, they might see kind of like darkness and hidden meaning and mystery everywhere. They could get stuck in their shadows. They might be at risk of losing touch with a greater spiritual perspective and love and light. Maybe they become a goth and dress in like fancy black clothes. Obviously, these are all generalizations, and the map is never the territory. Today, I'm focusing on the below journey because I found that spiritual traditions often emphasize the above journey and not as much as talked about this other process of going below. And there's a lot to say about those kinds of biases I'm not going to go into, but I think it's important to bring light to the below journey, so to speak, and give it its proper place, as it's often greatly feared and thus resisted, and it doesn't really have to be. Sort of like yin and yang, the above and the below need each other and complement each other. And psychedelic experiences can reflect both spaces, which we're going to look at later. But first, for some historical context, you kind of already saw my slide before, but there's this weird thing going on with Zoom and Google Slides where, yeah, it takes a while for these things to show up. Just like the descent, it's a little nonlinear. Um, so for historical context, one of the first epic poems in recorded human history describes this process, and it's called The Descent of Inanna. So 4,000 years ago, Inanna was a widely worshipped Sumerian goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, war, sex, justice, power, all the sexy stuff. She later enjoyed incarnations as the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, the Greek goddess Aphrodite, and the Roman goddess Venus, which we might be all more familiar with. So in this poem, the goddess decided to descend to the underworld, which was ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. And for the journey, like any self-respecting goddess, she dressed for the occasion, wearing the crown of heaven on her head, her breastplate, her golden ring, her scepter of power. She pounded on the doors of the netherworld and demanded entrance, was let in, and then escorted through 7 gates. And at each gate, she was asked to kind of take off a piece of what she brought with her. And when she was asking about it, she was told, these are the rules of the underworld. I mean, if you choose to come here, you have to play by our rules. So, she did what she was told. And by the end of the 7 gates, she was basically stripped naked of everything that she had with her. And as she stood before her sister, the queen of the underworld, as the sister got up from the throne, she went in and sat on it, which, was a big power move. And it kind of gave us an insight about maybe why she went on this journey to begin with. But the underworld did not look well upon her for that. And she was then killed. And her corpse was hung for 3 days and 3 nights. So we all make mistakes, right? But before she went down there, she had told her closest advisor, okay, if I disappear for 3 nights and 3 days or longer, then please send help. And so this advisor eventually sent help to her in the underworld, and she was eventually resurrected and revived. This is sort of like a precursor to the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, which you might be all more familiar with, where Persephone is another goddess who, while she was just minding her own business in a field, suddenly got taken down into the underworld by Hades, lord of the underworld. And then by the time she finally got out of it, it was discovered that because she had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds while she was in the underworld, now she was kind of doomed to spend 6 months of the year under there. And that was sort of how the Greeks explained the seasons. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because this ancient paradigm of going down into the underworld dying, being resurrected, um, and coming back alive again. And aligning this with the seasons kind of gives us a good model for how the descent can really work. And so there's sort of another way of kind of describing this process with a more contemporary poem called The Dakini Speaks, which should appear very soon. There it is. Okay. My friends, let's grow up. Let's stop pretending we don't know the deal here. Or if we truly haven't noticed, let's wake up and notice. Look, everything that can be lost will be lost. It's simple. How could we have missed it for so long? Let's grieve our losses fully, like ripe human beings. But please, let's not be so shocked by them. Let's not act so betrayed, as if life had broken her secret promise to us. Impermanence is life's only promise to us, and she keeps it with ruthless impeccability. To a child, she seems cruel, but she's only wild, and her compassion exquisitely precise. Brilliantly penetrating, luminous with truth, she strips away the unreal to show us the real. This is the true ride. Let's give ourselves to it. Let's stop making deals for a safe passage. There isn't one anyway, and the cost is too high. We are not children anymore. The true human adult gives everything for what cannot be lost. Let's dance the wild dance of no hope. Okay, so these two poems that kind of run the gamut of literary history kind of give us an idea of what this descent process looks like, which, by the way, encompasses depression, but can also encompass all kinds of emotional suffering. First of all, it feels like it's out of your control, and that's sort of the point. I'm sure we've all had some intimate experience of what that feels like in the past year. Like, when is lockdown going to be over? When is the virus going to be controlled? When are we going to get a vaccine? When are we going to get a vaccine appointment? None of it's in our control. And the second thing is that sometimes life takes you under, and it's not because there's something wrong with you. So even a goddess was capable of being stripped naked and killed, and so can we. People become depressed through many different pathways, most often after a loss or many losses, like loss of a job, loss of a relationship from a divorce or breakup, loss of a loved one, loss of one's health, loss of community, of culture, of a way of being, of identity. A lot of people have experienced multiple of these losses in a single year. Or maybe, in a similar vein, someone's been through a lot of trauma, maybe from childhood that they never really processed. And so they also find themselves in this sort of chronic descent journey. And I think a common reaction can be to blame yourself for what happened. And another common reaction is to blame everyone else. And both are totally human and understandable reactions. And often neither of that is true. The descent journey is not meant to be a punishment, and it's not a reflection that you haven't been spiritual enough or done enough therapy or something. So another thing about the descent is that she strips away the unreal to show us the real. It can basically strip everything away from us, not to be cruel, as the poem says, but to reveal to us what can never be taken away. And the only way to know what those things are that cannot be taken away is to go on this journey. And what we learn this way cannot be gotten any other way. Maybe we're someone who's a workaholic and suddenly we lose our job. Who are we without our job? Or we're married for 20 years and suddenly we're going through a divorce because our spouse cheated on us, or we're the one who cheated. And it's like, I didn't even think I could be someone who cheated. Who knew? So, these kinds of things happen. Those are just some common examples of what can trigger a descent journey, what can trigger a massive depression. And at the same time, it could be a journey of integration with our darker sides. As I was talking about, sometimes our dark sides will come up. And, our shadow is basically everything that we're unconscious of, that we don't want to deal with within ourselves, things we don't like, that are disowned, neglected, or forgotten. And so if we're unconscious of it, we don't really know what it is until it pops up, which is why it can be so surprising. But the shadow could also contain things that are really good, like if you, for example, grow up having to repress your sexuality, maybe that's in the shadow and it wants to come out to be lived. But the process of kind of learning to own and embody it can be really challenging and can also look like a descent journey. Another thing is that this process parallels the natural cycle of birth, death, transformation, and rebirth. It's not linear, it's not logical, like the turn of the seasons and like how death is a part of life. The descent journey follows natural law, which means that it's not meant to last forever, and it's nonlinear. I know people talk about the stages of grief, like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, but they don't occur in some set order. Like one day you might be accepting, and another day you're back to denial again. And that's kind of how it goes. There is no timetable and there is no schedule for grief. I do think that a lot of clinical depressions that can go on for years represent people kind of getting stuck in this descent journey process. And you like kind of never make it out to the rebirth, the transcendent place. And in that case, you may need more powerful tools to get you out of it, which we're going to talk about at the end. I think it's important to give the descent journey a place in our life, so that we recognize when we're in a descent journey and know that we're not in a time of creation, for example, and we don't hold ourselves to the same standards of like productivity. When we're in a descent, it's a time for rest, for deep listening, for incubation. But each descent does carry the seed of the ascent or rebirth within it. It's not meant to punish you, but ultimately meant to serve you. And lastly, it can come in all different flavors and intensities. So it could vary from, say, a few bad days in the week to maybe if you're a menstruating woman, maybe you go through a little mini descent every month with your period. Or it can go be a full-blown clinical suicidal depression, or it could be a global pandemic, anything on that scale. So another way to think about the descent is sort of as an initiation. So like how the poem encouraged us to grow up and not act so shocked and betrayed by the losses in life, the descent calls for a type of maturation. So the Western world doesn't have the kinds of initiations that many indigenous cultures do, of going through some period of challenge and trial, like during puberty, and to be inducted into a new identity as an adult member of a tribe. I mean, our version might include getting hazed in college, but we certainly lack a spiritual context for that, unless if we count an encounter with the spirits of alcohol. But anyway, before the recent decades of clinical research in psychedelics, these plants, from which most psychedelics are derived, have been used for millennia in indigenous cultures around the world for healing and spiritual development. So these are pictures of the Bwiti tribe. It's one of their initiation ceremonies. Bwiti is an indigenous spiritual discipline in the countries of Gabon, Cameroon, the Congo, and Equatorial Guinea in West Africa. And this is a picture of iboga, which is a psychedelic shrub found in that region and used in these ceremonies. And iboga might be more familiar to you as ibogaine, which is just one of 22 alkaloids derived from this plant. And it has been shown in research to show great potential in treating addiction, especially opioid addiction. But traditionally, iboga is used to induce a rite of passage. And the shamans who use iboga talk about how the purpose of initiation is to connect someone with their higher self or their soul. And when going through an iboga ceremony for healing, there's a direct question and answer session that happens where you're directly asking your higher self so that people can obtain direct self-knowledge. Shamans, across different cultures can take psychedelics for their own initiations into being healers. It's not the only tool, obviously, but it can be one of them. And during a shamanic initiation, they often experience scenes of dismemberment and death while journeying, and as part of the process of being reborn as a shamanic healer once they complete their initiation. And so if we look at depression through this lens, we can help to orient ourselves to seeing it as a process of maturation and growth instead of simply a disease. And I'm certainly not the first one to say this, but I know many spiritual leaders have also talked about, this collective time of suffering in its many guises as sort of like a global initiation that we're kind of all going through right now. And so what can psychedelics teach us about the descent space and navigating through it? Psychedelics. Okay, now mushrooms. So what can mushrooms teach us? Well, maybe it was no coincidence that mushrooms, and not just magic mushrooms, are sort of like the ambassadors of the underworld. As I learned while watching this fantastic film, Fantastic Fungi, which you should all see, the caps and stems that we typically associate with mushrooms are kind of only half the story. They are basically like the sexual organs, like the fruiting bodies of the fungi, whereas a lot of the fungi actually is underground, consisting of a rich network of mycelium that helps to decompose dead and dying organic matter to recycle the nutrients back to Earth. So mushrooms are basically all about death, transformation, and rebirth in nature, a process that the psyche's descent journey is also a part of. Okay, so how is a psychedelic experience like a descent journey, but on drugs? So basically, instead of, for example, a descent journey or a depressive period, whatever you want to call it, of, I don't know, 6 months to recover after a breakup, this is all taking place in 6 hours. So it's way more intense, but maybe also more efficient if done right. First of all, it also feels like it's out of your control. So, the number one thing that psychedelic therapists are taught to say, and that shamanic practitioners say when working with plant medicines, is surrender, because basically any attempt to control the experience by kind of fighting or resisting the effects will just make you more uncomfortable. Psychedelics can also strip away illusions, ego defenses. I mean, they definitely take down all your ego defenses. So, if someone's trying to navigate, I don't know, time and space and, even going to the bathroom while on psychedelics, it's really difficult because all the stuff that the ego normally uses to help you function in the world are kind of deactivated in that experience. Which means that the things that your ego is normally keeping at bay, say repressed memories, maybe of trauma, childhood memories, anything you didn't want to think about, that can all come up as well, which means that your shadows can also come up. So it's also sort of like potentially could lead you to a journey of integration with your shadows, and it potentially can be a path to wholeness. It is also nonlinear and not logical. We're sort of no longer operating under the rules of the above, but we're operating under the rules of dream time, of multidimensionality, the subconscious, which is why the tools that speak to the subconscious work really well, like music or, beauty and aesthetic environment. This is where emotions are magnified. And with the right setting and support, there can be tremendous gifts that can be harvested, which is why I think psychedelic integration therapy is so important. So that, with the appropriate support and guide, you don't end up maybe getting stuck in sort of like the darker parts of the journey or when really difficult material comes up. That being said, every psychedelic experience is different, even when the same person takes the same psychedelic substance. So, this is not to say every journey is like this, but these are just sort of some common themes that I've observed. So here are a collection, a small fraction of the vast amounts of amazing clinical research that has come out. And I've kind of focused it on psilocybin and depression because that's sort of where I've been doing research in. So there's just been a lot of really promising results from clinical research on psilocybin's, ability to treat depression. So I'm just going to talk about this most recent trial, the effects of psilocybin-assisted therapy on major depressive disorder. It just came out last November from Johns Hopkins. So basically, it's a randomized waiting list control trial. And waiting list means they either got psilocybin immediately or after an 8-week delay, so that the delayed group could kind of serve like a placebo, but everyone eventually gets psilocybin. It involved 27 participants who each got 2 psilocybin sessions with supportive psychotherapy. And what's remarkable with the effect on depression is that the improvement in depression is sustained at 4 weeks out, which is longer than ketamine, the only legal psychedelic in use right now. It was shown to be pretty safe, not a lot of side effects, unlike conventional antidepressants that we're all using now. And maybe the most remarkable thing is that the effect sizes were really big. And so effect size means the strength of the relationship between 2 variables, which in this case is sort of like the depression scores and whether or not psilocybin was taken. And so the effect sizes are basically 2.5 times greater than in psychotherapy studies and 4 times greater than psychopharmacologic studies. So this all just means that there's really great, strong evidence in science that psilocybin, can help with depression. So how do psychedelics really work? We can basically devote like an entire conference to this, and I am not going to go into detail about any of it. But just to kind of give you a really brief overview, basically on a very physical level, you know, whoops, okay. On a physical level, basically psychedelics, classic psychedelics like psilocybin, like LSD, they bind to what's called the 5-HT2A receptor, which is a type of serotonin receptor. And serotonin, if you probably already know, obviously we know has been involved in depression for decades, and that's the system that antidepressants currently target as well. So if we go up in view into the whole brain view, there's a really cool theory called the entropic brain theory, thought up by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris. Um, so basically, these are sort of like the models of what's going on in the brain. So when your brain is sort of like sober in its normal state, there's a certain amount of connection, certain amount of neural networks that are happening, and that kind of remains stable. And then when you're on a psychedelic, the amount of connections exponentially increase. Areas of the brain that never talked to other areas of the brain before are now talking to each other. And so basically, this is sort of like a state of increased disorganization or maybe chaos. And entropy basically means chaos. And so the theory about maybe why, this is leading to an effect on depression is that, diseases like depression and OCD can be thought of sort of as states of sort of over organization, of over rigidity. So basically, like the neural pathways have been the same for a long time, or it translates to someone sort of like always thinking the same thought loops, kind of really being really attached to the same beliefs about themselves, like I'm not enough, or I'm not lovable, or the world is a hostile, terrifying place. And it's really hard to kind of believe in something else or to get out of those repetitive thought loops. And so the thought that if you can kind of interrupt those patterns in this way, like really scramble it up, and this is totally the non-scientific way of saying it, but like if your mind were a snow globe and you kind of just shook it up, that's sort of how like psychedelics kind of affect it. Uh, Totally my version of how to describe this, but basically you get the idea. Um, and the thought is that maybe once the dust settles of the snow globe, you've been through this experience of all of your networks being disrupted, and it kind of gives you a chance to start afresh, to kind of create new networks. Um, Psychedelics have been shown to kind of increase the personality trait of openness afterwards, meaning that you are now more open to new ideas, new experiences, maybe new identities. And also, this process of scrambling can also be thought of sort of as a process of ego dissolution, like all the things that you thought you knew about yourself are now kind of being dissolved. Um, so sometimes when you're on psychedelics, things might get so chaotic, you might feel so open, and like all the walls that you've built up to organize yourself within and without, they're breaking down so completely that suddenly you feel like you have no more boundaries and you feel connected to everyone and everything is love. And that is when you're having a mystical experience. Whoops. Okay. Mystical experience. There we go. There's the mystical experience. Um, so basically, they are associated with better clinical outcomes. So this is not to say that everyone who takes a psychedelic has a mystical experience. Not everyone does. You can't really even control it. It is dose dependent, so it's more likely at higher doses, but it's not a guarantee. But intriguingly, the people who have undergo mystical experiences seem to have an even greater benefit on their depression. And so there are, spiritual and religious definitions of what a mystical experience is. And in science, this is sort of how they've measured it. They're measuring a sense of unity or oneness, a transcendence of time and space, a deeply felt positive mood, a sense of awesomeness, reverence, and wonder, meaningfulness of psychological or philosophical insight, ineffability and paradoxicality. Ineffability meaning like you can't really talk about it. It's so amazing. And usually it involves this process of ego dissolution or ego death right beforehand. I really love this about mystical experiences because it feels like it demonstrates to me that what is traditionally thought of as sort of like a spiritual encounter, like with God or with cosmic consciousness, can actually be shown in research to improve conditions like depression that, has been hitherto pretty medicalized. I think it really shows the importance of looking at the psychospiritual dimension of psychiatric diagnoses and kind of how to incorporate them into more mainstream scientific frameworks. Um, but as a caveat, I also just want to say that people can also experience clinical benefit even if they don't experience a mystical experience. Um, so here are, once again, just a small fraction of all the research out there on mystical experiences, and all of this is focusing on psilocybin. And in this paper, The Quality of Acute Psychedelic Experience Predicts Therapeutic Efficacy, they talk about measuring a sense of oceanic boundlessness, which is basically like the oneness that you get in mystical experiences. They kind of use a different scale. They're saying that an increased sense of this plus a decreased sense of the dread of ego dissolution or anxiety really predicted better outcomes in depression treatment. So if we translated that into another way of saying it, it's almost like the people who were more scared of their egos dissolving, who are more anxious and were holding on more tightly, and it was harder for them to let go, kind of, they got less of a benefit, and it almost seems as if like you need to let go, that you need to lose your ego before you can get the benefit. This is once again just the theory, but it does match, like older psychoanalytic theories that talk about how overcoming psychological resistance and struggle is really necessary for an emotional breakthrough. And here, once again, if we kind of zoom out a little bit, we see just another pattern of sort of some kind of psychological struggle or resistance, some period of darkness, some dissolving of your identity, some disorientation, leading to a breakthrough, and then hopefully into transcendent feelings of bliss and a mystical experience, if we should be so lucky. I think this parallels the bigger purpose of the descent journey, where the descent also consists of a slow dissolving of our ego, but over, a much longer time. And it's not induced by drugs. I mean, it could be, but usually not by psychedelics. But it's induced by the world or life, the things that happen to you, the things that happen inside of you, your genetic predisposition towards experiencing depression. Um, but I think that because there is this journey into a mystical experience and ultimately a therapeutic value, I think it also points to the promise and the hope for gifts on the other side of the descent journey, such as deeper compassion, humility, authenticity. And so I just want to talk also about some tools for navigating the descent, sort of as learned from psychedelics. So one tool, surrender, we already talked about that before. Just like in a psychedelic experience, if we're in a descent experience like we're having now, sometimes the best response is just to kind of surrender because we really can't control it anyway. I mean, if we've gone through this, we probably tried to control it and then have failed to control it. And as we've learned from psychedelic experience, more resistance often generates more suffering. And I don't mean surrender as in submission into, say, becoming a victim, like submitting to assuming the role of the defeated, the hopeless, the unloved. It's more about maybe like how Buddhism teaches us a sort of yielding or an acceptance of just what is. And meditation practice obviously can be really good for both navigating a descent journey and also a psychedelic journey as well. It's sort of like about trusting in the flow of life. Um, how do we draw purpose instead of despair? I think this whole talk is really about, looking at conditions like depression by seeing the deeper meaning and the grander purpose for them, instead of just as sort of a terrible experience that we're trying to alleviate through medications, even though there is that level of it as well. There is a greater storyline to all of this, a larger movement that's meant to serve you in some way and not destroy you. And so, how can you engage with the soul making instead of just giving up and summon forth more of who you are? Also, you can think about what choices you do have. Maybe so many things can feel like it's out of your control, but there are certain small things that you do have control over, places where you do have power and choice. And like focusing on those places is also an empowering move, such as choices about whether or not to care for yourself, choices about where you put your thoughts, choices around if you are experiencing anxiety, overwhelm. Can you just ground yourself? Can you bring yourself home? Try not to get stuck. Sometimes, it's hard. We just get stuck, and that's okay. I think some of the best advice about grief I've heard is just to keep it moving, which, means on a literal and a figurative level, like move your body, however way you can. That helps to move the energy, which helps to move the emotions, feel the feelings, let them go, listen to your pain. The descent asks you to slow down. What is she asking for? What parts of yourself is she asking you to reclaim and respond to? And if you need to use tools such as medications, professional help, maybe, a psychedelic experience, if that's appropriate for you and you can do it in a safe and legal setting, then please use all the tools to not get stuck. Um, Say yes to what you fear. So while undergoing training to be a therapist on the clinical trial I'm on, Bill Richards was talking about an experience where he had a participant who really wanted to get out of the room because he was terrified about something. And it seemed like he saw a giant snake in the corner of the room while he was, on psychedelics. But because Bill decided to keep him in the room long enough, the snake eventually turned into his mother. Um, we've all had those kinds of experiences, right? Snakes turning into our moms. Anyway, the point is, in psychedelic therapy, we're instructed, like if something comes up that you fear greatly, to not walk away from it, but to walk into it, to kind of like walk into the fire. And that usually helps to accelerate the process of kind of getting into maybe a more positive, a more therapeutic part of the journey. This is really hard to do in life. And sometimes we're going to spend a certain amount of time running away from what you fear. But, if you're brave enough, can you say yes to what you fear? Anchors to the above. So the goddess had like her advisor keep an eye out for her. Like if she disappeared, please get help. Do we have someone like this for us when we're going through a descent journey? A friend, a family member. Depression is a disease of disconnection. And so when you're depressed, you really like reaching out to someone is maybe the last thing you want to do. But I would say it's really the most necessary that you have to do. We cannot make it through this journey alone. And even if it's decimated your social networks, maybe reach out to a professional. Um, Whoops, sorry. You know, Things are really nonlinear in the descent journey. Um, Lastly, accept the ascent. Part of the purpose of this talk is to show the greater context that when we're going through a dark period of life, that is not all that there is. That just as sometimes we're plunged into it out of our control, sometimes the resurrection is also out of our control and is an act of grace. And if it starts coming to you, to kind of accept it, because one way to get stuck in the underworld is to be really attached or even addicted to the suffering and the pain and the victim identity, because that's what's familiar to us. And so if something good is happening, can we actually open up to it? Sometimes if we've been stuck in the dark, it's really hard to open up to it. But one of the skills is learning how to keep walking. And so I think that we're also in the process of rewriting the story that suffering is always necessary to grow or learn something, especially if we're using all the tools. I do think that the more we understand this terrain and have gone through it, the less time we really need to spend, in the darker parts. I think we can totally shorten a descent journey from, say, years to months or weeks to days, because eventually we are all veteran travelers and we know where we're going now. I mean, just think about how you're going to handle the next global pandemic, right? It's going to be much more smooth. So I know I already showed you a glimpse of my last slide, but like the descent journey, I'm going to surrender and wait for this PowerPoint to work. Okay, so I just want to read this to you. It is only in our dark fantasies that the underworld is a place to be feared. There are jasmine, rubies, vast terrains of underground rivers. There's beauty in the underworld that is undiscoverable in the above. There are also parts of you here that are magnificent and true. You may not choose your journey, but when the journey chooses you, trust that she has something in the depths for you that you need. And once you've claimed and received, the life that grows from you is your life. The garden that emerges from the fallow soil of your descent is your soul garden, rooted in the real ground of your being and stretching to a sun and a warmth that has been stripped of all illusion. Thank you so much for your attention. Here's some references. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.